So my name's Andrew Watterson. I'm a product designer with the AMP project, and I'm really excited today to talk about making AMP a great experience for everyone. So I just kind of want to start with the statement that AMP is here to improve the quality of web users' daily experience. And so you've heard about a lot of stuff today. There's more stuff to come, but it all kind of rolls up into this goal. And we actually even have one of our design principles that talks about this. And it says that the user experience is valued over the developer experience, and then both of those things are valued over the contributor experience. And so if you kind of read this diagram backwards, it means that we, as the contributors, are making stuff for developers and users. And as developers, you should be making stuff for your users. So everything really sort of contributes back to that great user experience. And that's really what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about how we design for the user experience. I want to talk about how we design for the developer experience. And then I don't want to talk about the implementer experience. I want to talk about how you can help, because this is really important for you as well. But before I do that, I just want to sort of set the tone for how we even think about design in the first place. So if you kind of look at the two sort of ends of our process, right? One end is that AMP makes stuff, and then the other end is that people have a better experience. And it's not quite that simple, obviously, but that's kind of what we're going for. But one of those things is that in order for people to have a better experience, we really need to go talk to real people, right? There's all kinds of different people, that all have, even from minute to minute, different attitudes towards things. They're very messy. There's different types of folks in the world. And so we do a lot of our UX work out of Google. And you can see here, this is actually just a Google tent that's set up on the street. And you can just tap folks on the shoulder and ask them to sort of tell you about how they use the internet and kind of what their experience has been. And that really informs a lot of the stuff that we do. So like I said before, this is like a little bit wrong. This is a little bit too simplistic. So I want to sort of propose a different diagram, which is that we really have these three steps, right? And one thing you'll notice about this diagram is that it's a cycle, right? We don't just sort of make stuff and then put it out there and then walk away and whatever's out there is what you get. We really want to constantly be refining and improving the stuff that we're making. And so sort of the three design steps that we want to follow are, number one, we want to identify a problem, right? We want to identify a user experience that could be better. And then we want to make something that improves it, right? We want to solve that problem. And then we want to measure. We actually have to make sure we actually improved it. Because again, it's very difficult to kind of understand whether or not you've made real changes that actually improve the lives of the people that you're trying to improve. And so we kind of need to go through all three of these steps. And the reason that this is so important is because AMP is opinionated, right? Unlike some other frameworks, we're not just sort of a pile of parts on the floor that you can sort of pick up and make a website. We actually have very specific ideas about what you should and should not do when you're implementing experiences for your users. So AMP is opinionated, so we really need to make sure that these opinions are not wrong, right? Opinions can be wrong, and so we constantly need to be very curious and always testing to make sure that we're doing things the right way. So yeah, be curious and set yourself up to learn. And that's kind of the guiding principle that we approach all of the design work we do on AMP with. So let's talk about the user experience, right? All these users that we've been talking about, what are they all about? So user experience answers the question, how does it work, right? At a very, so I mentioned before, you want to find an experience that you think could be better. And then you have to figure out, like, what's even our strategy for how to solve this, right? What are we even going to make? And it turns out we're web developers. And so more often than not, the thing we're going to make is a web app. Surprise. And that web app often consists of screens that we want to sort of guide folks through in a particular order, right? We want to give them a flow. And then on those screens, we've got buttons, we've got inputs, we've got all these different things. So the user experience design of any product, really, answers the question, how does it work from a very high level? Like, what are we even going to make? What's our strategy? All the way down to, like, what color should this button be? And one thing that's really interesting about AMP is in order to have these good user experience ideas, we can't just have, like, an idea about how to solve one particular problem, and then we just go solve it, right? AMP is on 1 million pages. So we really have to constantly be optimizing for as many different use cases as possible. We're actually solving thousands or millions of user experience problems at once. And then we have to sort of take all that and like boil it down into this single set of components that works as easily as possible across all these different experiences. So I'll give an example. we're right now rethinking the way that amp-carousel works. How many folks in this room have actually interacted with amp-carousel? Yeah. So this is, I think, sort of one of our more popular components. And it's basically just a gallery. You know, if you're not familiar with a carousel, it's a gallery of media. So you can see here, we've got this photo, and then we've got these little like arrow buttons you can swipe or page to different photos. And when we started this project, the engineer that I'm working with came to me and was like, you know, I figured it out, right? I like thought really hard about how to do all the carousel customizations. You can like show different numbers of slides. We could have arrow buttons or not. We could like, you know, position the media if it's like different sizes in different ways. You can have different interactions. And like he had all these ideas immediately about how to implement these things. And I was really excited. As a designer, it's really great to have engineers who can actually implement the stuff that you want to make. But if you sort of start at this like really abstract level, right? If you sort of imagine like, you know, what does it even mean to be all possible carousels at once? You risk not solving a human problem, right? And so you always want to focus on what you can do, right? What you can do and what you can implement is very important. But you never want that to distract from what you should do, right? You never want that to distract from what is the user experience that we're actually trying to enable here. And so we actually sort of tried to focus on specific use cases. We wanted to brainstorm what are the user experiences that we're trying to enable with amp-carousel. So one is we have a lot of AMP publishing sites, obviously. Often on a news article, you'll have a gallery of media that you want to be able to get through. Just home pages, right? If you're being introduced to a new company, a lot of times companies will have a gallery of featured products or deals or events that they've put on. Related products. If you're on a shopping site and you sort of go through an item and it's not quite exactly what you were looking for, you might be looking to like look at related products. What else can I see on this site? And then recipes. We actually haven't seen this quite as often on the web, but we were thinking, well, hey, you've got a gallery of media. You can page through it step by step. That sounds sort of like doing a recipe. So we wanted to support all these use cases, and we wanted to imagine, you know, like, OK, what if we did have a carousel that supported recipes? What would that kind of look like? And then for all these others as well. And so you can kind of see we were able to draw out what we thought a pretty good version of all these different carousels would be. They all kind of look a little bit different. They have different layout choices and all that. But then, of course, we want to do better than imagine, right? It's not enough for us to sit in our office and like draw out different carousels all day. And so we wanted to go talk to real people. And so we did this. We actually went to a coffee shop and tapped folks on the shoulder and said, hey, can we talk to you about how you use the internet for 15 minutes? And people are actually always really cooperative when you do this. It's fun. And so what we had done is we had taken, we found a list of carousels that we really liked on other people's websites that were sort of similar to like what we were sort of imagining for our AMP version. And so then we were able to go to people and just sort of watch them use these websites and not even talk about the carousel, right? Just be like, hey, you're on this shopping website. What do you notice? And see sort of how they react, and especially once they hit the part of the interaction with the carousel, what are they doing? What are they noticing? How much are they enjoying it? How much are they able to actually solve whatever problem, whatever user problem we set out to solve? And if you've never done this, by the way, if you've never like gone out and watched someone use your product or some other product, like not in a sales or demo setting, it's super awesome, right? You always learn stuff from talking to people. And I'm sort of an introvert. I don't actually like talking to people that much. But I always get back from these days, and I'm like, man, we learned so much stuff. Now we know what to do next. So it's really exciting. And you sort of learn two categories of things, right? One category is that you learn what you wanted to know, right? You have these questions about like what's good and bad about my product. You kind of wonder about this stuff when you're making it. And you can learn what you wanted to know. So in our case, we were wondering if people would be able to find a carousel in the first place, right? You've got this image, but there's more stuff hiding behind the image. There's more images that you can page through or get to. And so we really wanted to make sure that people would be able to understand that something was a carousel. And it turned out from these studies that we ran, no one has any problem with this. People have been using carousels, particularly in the use cases that I mentioned before, all over the internet. They're there. They do not need help finding a carousel. We didn't have to like make the arrow buttons really, really big. We didn't have to do some like cool animation that was like, oh, hey, there's more content here. We didn't have to do any of that stuff. So that was great, right? We could sort of cross that off of our list based on the feedback we got from users. And we could actually just like sort of cut off what had been hours and hours of discussion about like how big do we want the arrow buttons to be by having those conversations directly with real people. The more exciting category of stuff, though, that you learn is you learn what you never would have asked about in the first place, right? Stuff that we were not wondering about in our office actually came up in these user research studies. So in this example, it was that as folks were navigating through carousels, they'd be like, oh, man, I really wish I understood where in the carousel I was, like how many more slides there are. We had one participant went so far as to say, if I'm going through all these different slides and I can't tell how many are left, I feel tricked into like consuming more and more content, right? And that's a red flag for us. Users feeling tricked is not typically one of the things that we're trying to go for. We don't have a design principle about that, but I think it's safe to say that we don't want that. And so that was actually something we had to put on our radar. We had to go back and we had to see like, OK, great. What is our story about how to make sure that people always know where they are in a carousel? Oh, sorry. There's some Japanese here, too. And then you sort of take all these insights back to your office, and you turn them into a user experience design. I don't want to talk about this too much today, but there are sort of more of the technical aspects to this process. But I want to talk about something else. I want to talk about designing for the developer experience. So I said this before, AMP makes stuff, and then users have a better experience. But we are at a developer conference, essentially. So you may notice that there's something missing from this diagram. Who knows what it is? Nope, nobody? We're at a developer conference. What's missing? It's developers. Man, we are sleepy. Everyone wants lunch. So AMP cares a lot about users, right? But we're not actually really a user-facing product, right? None of the users that actually consume any of the AMP sites out there know that they're using AMP, and we like it that way, right? We don't want them to know that they're using AMP, because that's a technical detail that they don't need to care about. AMP is making stuff for developers to implement a user experience, which means that everything I just said about designing for the user experience and understanding sort of what the problems are and how we're going to solve them and making sure we actually solve them successfully, that applies to developers too. And so really, we're here for you. We need to make sure that the experience of actually using AMP, of developing with AMP, is just as good as this user experience that we're trying to accomplish, because really we could make all these cool components that have like a really fantastic user experience, and if developers are not successfully using them in their sites, it doesn't really help us. We have not improved the user experience of the web at all by making components that developers can't use. So how do we do this? We're not brand new to this problem. We have road shows. We actually go all over the world. And it's particularly interesting to go to places that don't have a strong tech community. And we're able to talk to engineers and developers who are using AMP about how that's going for them and what their sort of unique issues are. We also have a GitHub. You've heard earlier today that AMP is an open source project. And so a lot of our planning, right? What are the features that folks are asking for? What are the bugs that folks are reporting? And how do we feel about them? Are we going to fix them? Are we not going to fix them? All that discussion sort of happens out in the open on our GitHub. And then we also have a Stack Overflow page. And this is actually one that I think is particularly interesting, because this is where developers come and they say, I'm trying to implement a thing, and I'm trying to use AMP to do it, and I can't figure out how to do that. And this gives us insight into two things. One is it's actually really hard for us to know what people are trying to make with AMP, right? We can go through like the whole AMP cache and like look at all the URLs that are already on AMP and see what people did make with AMP. But it's very difficult for us to know like what are people trying to make with AMP and are not able to make with AMP. And so on Stack Overflow, that's kind of the best way that we have to figure this out right now, where if someone's sort of trying to make something and can't figure out how to do it, then either it's because we don't have that feature yet, and we can then have a discussion about like, oh, do we want to add this feature so that this person can make, this developer can make this user experience, or it's because we just haven't explained how to use AMP to make that thing well enough. And it turns out the explanation is really important as well. So I want to modify the sort of statement I made before, that AMP is here to improve the user experience of the web. That's still true. But from the developer side, AMP is really here to allow developers to get to that good user experience faster. We really want to increase the speed that you guys can get to your your sort of final goal. Because nothing about AMP is magic, right? Like AMP is just sort of a JavaScript library. Like if you put in a lot of time, you could probably go home and write it yourself. But we don't want that, right? We want to build these tools so that you don't have to write it yourself, so that you can actually focus on the user experience that you're trying to deliver to your users. So I want to come back here, and I want to just sort of reiterate that all these steps also apply to the developer experience, right? So what's an experience that you have while coding that could be better, right? We want to identify those things. We want to be very aware of what that is. Then we want to make something that improves it. Hopefully the AMP library as a whole makes that a little bit better right now. Otherwise, you probably wouldn't be here. But then we also want to sort of make sure that we actually improve this. And then we want to keep doing that over and over again until using AMP is literally the best coding experience you could possibly have. It sounds a little hyperbolic, but that's actually our goal. So let's talk about sort of what we need to know in order to sort of figure that out and to make that happen. So the first thing we need to know is, what are you trying to build, right? So there's sort of this diagram where there's stuff AMP is good at, and then there's stuff you care about. And we really hope that there's something in the middle of this diagram. So AMP has always been really focused on speed. And when we started with AMP, we supported publishing websites. That was sort of our main focus. And so 2 years ago, if you were a publishing website that really wanted to be fast, AMP was great for you. And we've sort of since then expanded into e-commerce. And so we're sort of going around and pitching folks and trying to even get into the conversation. Like, are you even considering using AMP? Does AMP even sort of help solve any of the things that are important to you? That's something we really need to kind of keep tabs on. And actually, a really interesting anecdote about this. We had some folks from Google go out and talk to the 1,000 biggest websites in the US and say hey, use AMP, and it's fast, and it's great at all these things. And many of them actually have really large engineering teams that have figured out performance and have really made an investment in performance. And they were kind of like, our website's plenty fast. We don't really need that. And I think that was really interesting. I would not have expected there to be a lot of particularly large companies that were sort of done with website performance. But that really just sort of reiterates that we need to constantly be making sure that we're solving the problems that folks want to have solved. So that's kind of the strategy question, right? Did we get our strategy right? Is AMP even in the conversation to begin with? So the second thing is more just once you sort of have decided to use AMP, what's standing in the way of you building the thing you're trying to build with AMP? So I mentioned these use cases before. If you're building a news gallery, if you're building a related products gallery, we're here for you. We've got this. It's on our radar, and we're going to make this. And so we have this other sort of similar diagram, which is stuff that AMP provides, and then stuff, components you need. And up until an hour ago, when you saw the AMP script talk, it was very difficult to integrate external code, integrate anything that AMP didn't already make for you into your AMP page. And so we really need to make sure we have as full coverage as possible in this diagram, right? We need to make all of the components, all of the pieces of your page that are important, we need to make sure we have components that support that. And so one example of this is we recently released docking in AMP Video. And so we sort of went out there and we thought about what are the experiences that's sort of hard to implement right now. And one of them was this thing that you've probably seen where you're playing a video, maybe you're making a recipe, you're trying to grill some eggplant, and then as you scroll up and down the page, that video can actually stay with you, and it can sort of shrink itself, and you can still watch it as you're using this recipe. So we noticed that there was really no way to do this in AMP, and so we had to go out and sort of add support for this to the AMP Video component, and we launched this I think about a month ago. So new stuff all the time. And that's kind of the detail level question, right? What is standing in the way of you building, whatever design you've come up with AMP? Well, it's components. And if we don't have the components that you need, then we need to figure out how to make them. And the third question, and the question I'm sort of proudest of us for asking, is what makes developing an AMP a pleasure or a pain, right? We don't want to stop at, are we even in the conversation? And we don't even want to stop at, is this technically possible? We want to stop at, yeah, AMP is a really great experience. And so if you sort of think about all these different customizations, right? We need to be able to explain these well, and we need to implement them with the syntax that kind of makes sense, that isn't leaving you, scrolling through 15 pages of documentation and scratching your head trying to figure out how to make the carousel do the thing that you want it to do. And so the sort of example here is that we recently added infinite scroll to AMP list. So you can kind of see here, scrolling down this list, and then when I hit the bottom, it sort of automatically loads new options, and you can see the sort of scroll bar is constantly becoming a different size. And we actually worked really closely. This website right here is AliExpress. And we worked really closely with them to figure out how can we make this component like really work, right? Not just sort of meet the minimum bar of functionality, but actually do all the things that you need it to do in the real world. So we actually were working with them really closely while we were implementing this component. And they were sending us feedback nearly every day that affected everything from the syntax choices we made up to sort of some edge cases that we hadn't initially anticipated. So working really closely with developers to make sure that this actually works for real folks when they're at their keyboards coding is a really, really important part of our process. So we've got these sort of two folks here, right? We've got the AMP team. We're the web development experts and the user experience experts, and we really want to help you build this stuff. And then we have you, who are your own the experts on your own product and business, who need to be able to decide what to build. And in order to have this conversation, right, where you tell us what you want to build, and we sort of tell you how we think you should build it, we need to be able to communicate about these things. And this is the biggest thing I want to highlight today, right? So if you're thinking about talking to the AMP team, we want to talk to you. We actually have a booth that's right, somewhere over there. I don't know what direction it's in. And we're going to be standing there for the next 2 days. And we would really love to hear about what your experience with AMP has been. What are the good things? What are the bad things? What are you trying to build? And what have you not been able to build? And how can we help enable that in the future? If you cannot talk to us these next 2 days, we're actually also taking signups at this bit.ly link or over at our booth to just kind of leave your contact information, and we'd love to get in touch with you later. We are, like I said before, we're really here for you, and this is a very important part of the job that we do in making AMP. And this is so important, I'm actually going to turn this slide green. If anyone's asleep, like, this is it. Come talk to us, please. And then the sort of second part is, how does the AMP team talk to you, right? How does the AMP team communicate about how we think that you should actually be building these user experiences that you're trying to build? The first thing is documentation. I kind of alluded to this before, right? But if we made all the best components that had all of the greatest user experience, that wouldn't actually help us that much unless developers are able to use them to implement these websites. And so if you ask people what the AMP project makes, they might say a framework, they might say components, but really, the documentation is as important a part of our product as any of the other stuff that we make. Because we really need to be able to show you, for a given design, how to make that, right? What components to use, and then how to successfully implement those components. But the second way we can communicate is using the component APIs themselves. So again, if we think back to these customizations, let's imagine that there's like eight of these customizations, right? So we're building a new amp-carousel. We have 8 different things we want to be able to customize. And just for the sake of argument, we'll say that each of those things is just true, false, right? There's 8 binary attributes on this component. So that gives us 64 possible carousels that we can make with this new component we're making. And that's great, right? Some of those are going to be a really great user experience, and those are the ones we kind of want to push you toward. We want to sort of encourage you to implement those carousels on your page. Some of them are going to be a fine user experience. They might be appropriate in some contexts. And some of them, just because the options don't always sort of match up that well, right? Some of them are just going to be a bad user experience. And we don't want folks to kind of implement on those pages, but just because of the way that the component design has worked, they may be possible. So we want to steer you away from the red and sort of steer you toward the green. So how do we do that? One way is we can provide strong defaults, right? We don't want there to be a huge ramp up, right? We don't want you to kind of like, pour out the Lego set of amp-carousel and have to like kind of stare at the instructions or stare at all these pieces to figure out how to like get the thing that you want, right? We want you to just open the box and have like this Lego Jeep just sort of come right out. And it's important to notice that the Jeep on the right is not actually any less flexible than the thing on the left. It's just already built for you. And so if you want to customize it, if you want to build it a different way, then you can sort of take it apart and do a new different thing. And so it's really important that when we have attributes in our components, that whatever you when you just type in like, I want an amp carousel, we can actually get you to a reasonable experience that then you can sort of decide how you want to customize as quickly as possible. The other thing I would say is that if we want developers to move faster, right, which is what we said we wanted before, that often means making things simpler. And making things simpler means fewer options. And fewer options sounds scary, right? Nobody wants fewer options, particularly not engineers. But let's talk about how this might look in sort of a component, in a component framework. So I've used this sort of, these are the attributes picture a million times. So these are the sort of customizations we want to go for. And let's imagine that we're making a component that's called amp-carousel. And it's pretty focused, right? It's focused on making carousels. It's got all these customizations. And it takes some learning, right? Because it has so many different customizations, you have to sort of do some figuring out to get the carousel you want. And this sort of like silly dot diagram at the bottom shows you that you can get good carousels, and you can get medium carousels, and you can get bad carousels. And this is kind of the way that we've approached component making in the past. But as we were designing amp-carousel, we actually made this observation that there are really sort of two, we went through all these use cases. We really thought about what user experiences we were trying to enable. And we realized that there's basically two different types of carousels. Right? There's one type that we're calling amp inline gallery that's sort of focused on one piece of content at once, right? It's like the homepage slide or the news gallery slide. And there's a second one that sort of gives you a stream of different options that you can more leisurely sort of swipe through and sort of choose what you want. And I mentioned strong defaults before. It's very difficult to make a carousel component that has both of these sort of like ready to go by default. It's very difficult to kind of make a component that has options that sort of are easy to understand that sort of enable both of these use cases. And so if we actually break these out into two different components, right, then we have two very focused components that each have some customizations, but they're much easier to learn. Because in choosing the component you want to use, you've already told us a lot about the experience that you're trying to make. And so we can sort of hold your hand and guide you through making that experience much more easily. And again, you can see this dot diagram on the bottom. It enables many fewer bad use cases, right? Because there aren't as many conflicting options, while still sort of enabling all the good use cases. And then I think this sort of continuum wouldn't be complete unless we talked about just all possible JavaScript, right? And now with amp script, this is much more possible than it ever was before. And in contrast to sort of the two components that I've mentioned, all possible JavaScript has no focus, right? You can make pretty much literally anything. It's got infinite flexibility, but it takes a really long time to make those things, right? It's very difficult to sort of learn and to develop and to debug and doing all these different things. But what's interesting about this is from a developer perspective, all three of these options are now actually available in AMP. Well, sorry. AMP inline gallery and stream gallery are coming in a few months. So they will be soon. And so we're actually very interested. I mentioned before AMP is opinionated. We have opinions about how you should do web development. We think that actually using the simplest possible component that's relatively opinionated about sort of how to implement a great user experience is a great way. But we give you all this flexibility to either use the even more flexible but harder to learn base carousel, or to just roll your own carousel in AMP script. And we're really, really excited to see how developers are going to sort of interact with these things, and whether or not the sort of simpler components are going to lead to sort of the fastest road to a great user experience. So I want to end with just sort of how you can help. And I mentioned before that it's much more difficult than you might think for us to understand what it is you're trying to make, and how the decisions that we make in AMP affect you. And so the more you talk to us, the more our opinions going forward will be better for you, right? This is a win-win for everybody. And so like I said before, we have a booth. Please come and chat with us. We'll be standing over there for the next 2 days. Please sign up to chat with us afterwards. We have a ton of questions, right? We've been sitting in our offices wondering about what frustrates you, and how do you work, and where do you find answers when you're lost, and all these different things. How do you even pick what component you want to use? But also, we want to hear whatever you want to tell us. It's always the stuff that you don't anticipate. It's always the questions that you didn't have that are the most interesting in user experience. So please sign up. Again, this is the bit.ly link again. And I was thinking about how you could sort of identify us at our booth. And I really wanted to make these badges that say, "Do you hate AMP? Tell me why." And my manager didn't really like that idea very much. So yeah, just look for me. And we have some other members of the UX team here. And yeah, thank you very much.